Quaid Azam, Part 174. Since the Hindus were in majority in India, they assumed it for themselves that when the British would leave, they would automatically become the rulers of India. And it would have been unacceptable to Muslims because the kind of attitude the Hindus had shown at that time. If we see the controversies of 1920s, I'm specifically talking about the third decade of the 20th century. I'm not talking about the Khilafat movement. I'm not talking about the post-1947 era. I'm specifically talking about the controversies of 1920s. Don't you know what actually has happened in the 1920s? In 1920s, in the name of Hindu nationalism, there have been so many uprising of Hindu movement. There have been so many conflicts arisen by these Muslims. If suddenly we can talk about RSS, not just talking about RSS, but talking about many of the other people as well. RSS was also generated in 1920s, and what actually RSS stood for? It was not just RSS, but many of the other organizations in those days who had a specific target of victimizing Muslims. Well, I can name many of them. Arya Samaj was there, RSS was there. There were many of the other organizations working specifically against Muslim interest, specifically against Muslim community. And they were financed, they were supported, and there were many schemes. There were schemes to convert Muslims into Hinduism. And this is what they had been doing by hook and crook. In fact, the life had become very difficult for Muslim community over there, and more so for those poor peasant Muslims. Naturally, when I talk about the Muslim community, in fact, I talk about those peasantry, I talk about those innocent people, I talk about those poor people who were in fact the victim of the British regime. And they were not only the victim of the British regime, but then at the same time they were the victim of those Hindu clutches. What actually they had done, they had, of course, made life difficult for Muslims over there, and there were difficulties for all of them. And it all happened in the 1920s. It's not just on the political front, talk about the economy of the Muslims over there. When we talk about the peasantry of the Muslims, what actually had happened in Bengal? The situation worsened so very much in Bengal, which was a very productive province, rich in agriculture, had fallen to ground. Their economy was shattered just because of these wrong policies. And the life for Muslims had become so difficult over there. In specifically 1920s, there were so many movements, there were so many fronts working against Muslims. And they had tried their best to convert them to Hinduism. And of course, the social clutches on the Muslims were so bad that we couldn't stay there for a very long period of time. I can share some statistics with you. The population in the population ratio in 1920s for Muslims in India was roughly 25%. And the population today, that we have the ratio in India, that is 19% for Muslims. And the Muslim population alone in India is the largest population in a single country in the world. Well, Quaid Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah, now this is a very, very important thing, and I believe you should listen to it and try to understand. Quaid Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah propagated for in India, where they will have their representation in those political bodies, talk about the legislatures, talk about the provincial legislatures, talk about the central legislature, talk about the executive bodies, where the Muslims would have their representation according to the population and under certain circumstances more than the population in the country.